Namaste children. Till now, in getting to know plants, what we have studied. The main groups of plants, flowering and non-flowering, with examples. Then the three main categories of plants, herbs, shrubs, trees, and examples. Then weak stemmed plants, creepers and climbers. Then the plant systems, mainly root system and shoot system. Then roots, their function, types of roots, taproot system and fibrous root system. Then modifications of roots. Then stem, its functions, modifications of stem. Then the leaf, the structure of leaf, leaf venation. Then functions of leaf. Then phyllotaxy and modifications of leaf. Then structure of flower, floral parts, and in that sepals and petals are vegetative parts, whereas stamen and carpel or pistil are reproductive parts. Now, today we are going to learn about pollination. What is pollination? Now, the pollen grains are transferred from the anther to the stigma of either the same flower or another flower of same kind by wind, water or insects. This process is called as pollination. After pollination, the ovary swells up and changes into a fruit and the ovules change into seed. Definition of pollination. The transfer of pollen grains from the anther to the stigma of a flower is known as pollination. Pollen grains are immobile, that means they cannot move. They cannot reach the stigma by themselves. Since they are immobile, an external agent is required for this. It can be wind, water, animal, or growth contact, that is soil. Types of pollination. There are two types of pollination, self-pollination and cross-pollination. Coming to the agencies of pollination, there are two types of agencies, that is abiotic agencies, that is non-living agencies of pollination are wind and water, whereas biotic agencies, those are living organisms, that is insects, birds, bats, snails, ants, snakes, etc. Types of pollination, self-pollination. If the pollen from the anther is transferred to the stigma of the same flower, then it is called as self-pollination. Here in this picture, you are observing that the pollen is transferred from these pollen grains to the same flower's stigma. So, single flower is involved. So, if the pistil of the same flower collects the pollen grains, which is from the stamens of that flower only, it is called as self-pollination. Pollen from the anther of one plant is transferred to the stigma of the different plant. Here, in this, the pollen grains will be sticking to the any agent, that is insect, when it visits for the nectar, and this when sits in another flower of same kind, then it deposits the pollen grains onto the stigma of that flower. This type of pollination is known as cross-pollination, insect pollination. So what are the features required for the wind pollination? That is, wind should be an agent. Means what are the features required and what is the reason? See, if the pollen grains from the flower has to be transferred by the wind, it will have small petals, often brown or dull green color, no fragrance or no scent, no nectar also, because it does not need to attract insects. Pollen produced will be in great quantities, that means in large quantities, because most of the pollen will be wasted when wind blows. So most does not reach the anther of the stigma of the flower. So in large quantities, the pollen grains will be produced. Pollen is very light and smooth, so it can be blown easily by the wind. Anthers are loosely attached and dangle out, swinging out to release pollen into the wind. Stigma hangs outside the flower to catch the drifting pollen in the wind. Stigma is feathery or net-like to catch the flowing pollen along with the wind, that is drifting pollen. Examples of some flowers which are by undergoes wind pollination. Coming to the insect pollination, insect pollinated flowers should have the following features, that is large, they must be large, brightly colored petals they must have, and often sweetly scented, because usually these flowers will contain nectar. These all the features will be attracting the insects. Moderate quantity, not much quantity, but in less quantity the pollen will be produced, and since less wastage will be there than the wind pollination, so pollen often sticky or spinky to stick to insects legs. Anthers will be prim and inside the flower, and stigma also inside the flower only. These two are brush against insect's legs. Stigma has sticky coating, so pollen sticks to it. These are some of the examples which are pollinated by insects. Now once again, pollination, the transfer of pollen grains from anther to the stigma of a flower is known as pollination. There are two types of pollination, self-pollination and cross-pollination. In self-pollination, only one flower is involved and transfer of pollen grains within that flower is occurring. That is called as, that means the pollen grains from the anther are transferred onto the stigma of the same flower. Then cross-pollination, transfer of pollen grains from one flower to the another, but that here two similar flowers are involved. So pollen grains from the anther of one flower are transferred onto the stigma of the other flower. Then pollen of different plants have different shapes and sizes. Pollen are small and light so that they can be carried by the agents of pollination. Now, what are the agents of pollination? Plants generally do not transfer the pollen from one flower to another by themselves. Although a few plants do have self-pollination, pollen from flowers anther pollinating its own stigma. These plants need agents of pollination to help them. So these are the pollen grains, how the pollen grains will be. Now, agents of pollination. Pollen will stick to parts of the insect's body. Example, bags situated on the legs of the bees. So, insect pollination. Insect is one of the agent. Next, these are the other agents, other animals like birds and bats. Wind. Wind is a biotic agent, whereas insects and other animals are biotic agents of pollination. Now, other animals, these animals are usually nectar drinking animals like sunbirds. And agents of pollination, if you consider bats, these animals are usually nectar drinking animals like nectar feeding bats. And agents of pollination, wind, tend to be smaller and lighter in order to be carried by the wind. Next, what is mean by fertilization? When the male sex cells join with the female sex cells within the ovule, that resulting formation of embryo then develops into a seed. Unfertilized ovules cannot become seeds. Fertilized ovules become seeds. Now, already we have seen the parts of flower. These are the sepals. These are the petals. This is the filament, anther contains pollen grains, and total together is called as stamen. It is the male reproductive organ, whereas this is in the middle is female reproductive organ or pistil. It contains a tube-like structure known as style, and the sticky head part is of this pistil is known as stigma, and flask-like shape base is known as ovary, basal part of the pistil is, and inside the round ball-like structures are known as ovules. Grains are the male cells, ovules are the female cells. How it takes place. After fertilization, pollen grain lands on the stigma, grows into a tube-like structure which is known as pollen tube. It takes the sperms to the egg of the ovule. Then here it fertilizes with the egg and forms the embryo. The pollen tube grows down to the style into the ovary and enters the ovule. Now, for fruits and seeds to be formed, male and female cells must meet and fuse. Since male and female sex cells are involved, this is called as sexual reproduction. When the male cells meet with the female cell, they join together. This is called as fertilization. So the fusion of male gamete with the female egg is known as fertilization. Now, in short, when the male sex cells join with the female sex cells within the ovule, resulting in the formation of embryo and then develops into a seed. Unfertilized ovules cannot become seeds. Fertilized ovules become seed. After seed formation, the growth of the root through the seed coat and the shoot system is formed, that is called as germination. Now are the four stages of germination. This is common garden bee. Now, what are the steps involved in germination? When a seed lands on a place with sufficient warmth, water and air, it starts to germinate. Sunlight is not necessary for germination. The root of the baby plant grows out of the seed to form a seedling. The seed coat falls on the ground. The shoot appears and breaks through the soil, and the first leaves show. The cotyledons fall on the ground. The young plant now can make its own food with the sunlight by photosynthesis. Now, what is germination? When a seed lands on a place with sufficient warmth, water and air, it starts to germinate. Sunlight is not necessary for germination. First, the root of the baby plant grows out of the seed to form a seedling. During this stage, the seedling cannot make its own food. It gets its energy from the food stored in its seed leaves, that is cotyledons. Then seed leaves are the parts of a seed that protect the baby plant. Next, the shoot appears and breaks through the soil and the first leaves unfold. The young plant is now able to make its own foods as the green leaves makes food in the sunlight, that is by the process of photosynthesis. Note that seed leaves are the parts of a seed that protect the baby plant. These leaves are the part of a plant that manufactures food. Once again, pollination is the transfer of pollen grains from the anther to the stigma of a flower. Agents of pollination, animals that help plants to transfer the pollen from one flower to another, for example, insects and animals, wind, water, etc. Fertilization, when the male sex cells join with the female sex cells within the ovule, is called as fertilization. That is, fusion of male gamete with the female gamete or egg is known as to form embryo is known as fertilization. Germination, the growth of the root through the seed coat is known as germination, which is showing the process of photosynthesis. The green pigment which is present in the leaf is called as chlorophyll, which will be can able to absorb the sunlight, and carbon dioxide goes through the stomatal pore of the leaf. Then water is absorbed by the roots. This is picture is depicting photosynthesis. Next picture is for transpiration. Actually, this is the assignment for you children, pictorial assignment. This is the taproot system. Stamens, the flower,